Fairy Tales, written by Terry Jones. Read by Joan Greenwood, Michael Horden, Bob Hoskins, Helen Mirren, Tim Rice and Terry Jones.
The Big Noses. There was once an island in the middle of the ocean where everybody's nose was far too big. The chief of the island got in a boat and sailed to the place where the wisest of all men lived. "Now, what is the problem?" asked the wisest of all men. "Well," said the chief of the island, "all my people are unhappy because their noses are too big. We can't get our sweaters over our heads because our noses are so big. We can't enjoy a drink without hitting our noses on the other side of the cup. We can't kiss each other because our noses get in the way. But worst of all, we don't even like each other because of our ugly great noses. Can you help us by making our noses smaller?" "Well," said the wisest of all men, "I cannot make your noses smaller. Only the magician who lives by the burning lake could do that. And even he could not do it for all your people. But come back in 3 days' time, and perhaps I shall be able to help you." So the chief of the island stayed in that land for 2 days and 2 nights. And while he was there, he went to the magician who lived by the burning lake, and the magician cast a spell over his nose, and made it very small indeed. And on the 3rd day, the chief went back to the wisest of all men, and said, "Well, have you thought of an answer?" The wisest of all men looked at the island chief in amazement. Finally he said, "Is that really you?" And the chief said, "Yes, of course it is." And the wisest of all men said, "But what has happened to your nose?" So the chief of the island told him how he had been to the magician. And the wisest of all men shook his grey head and said, "You seek one solution for yourself and another for your people, and that's not good." "Well, it's too late now," replied the chief. "So what is your solution for my people?" "First," said the wisest of all men, "you must go to the volcano that lies on the other side of this land, and take the ashes from its mouth, and rub them into your hair and hands and all over your body. Then put on these robes, and return to your people, and tell them that you are Chan Tanda." The chief looked amazed, and said, "But you are Chan Tanda, the wisest of all men. Why should I pretend to be you?" "You must," said Chan Tanda, "and believe me, you will thank me for it." So the chief took the clothes, and Chan Tanda told him what he was to say to his people, and then he went to the volcano, and climbed to the very top, where the smoke and flames came billowing out of the ground, and he rubbed the ashes into his hair and hands and all over his body until he was a dusty grey colour, just like Chan Tanda himself. And he put on the clothes and sailed back to his people. When he arrived, they all said, "Where is our chief?" And he replied, as he had been instructed, "Your chief says he will not come back to this island until his people have become more reasonable." "What does he mean?" they all cried. "We may have big noses, but we're not fools. Tell him to come back." "He says he won't come back until you've changed some of your foolish ways," said the chief of the island. "What foolish ways?" they said. "What does he mean?" "For a start, he says you must stop sitting out in the rain playing Ludo." "But we like sitting out in the rain playing Ludo," they cried. "Secondly, you must stop using egg cups for your tea." "But we like drinking tea out of egg cups," they cried. "And thirdly, you must bend your heads to one side when you kiss." "But we've always kept them upright," they cried. "Otherwise your chief will never return," said the chief of the island. Well, they held a meeting, and decided to do what was asked so that their leader would return. And before long, they discovered that when they didn't sit out in the rain playing Ludo, their sweaters didn't shrink, and they were able to put them on over their heads without their noses getting in the way. And when they gave up drinking tea out of egg cups, they found that their noses no longer hit the other side. And when they bent their heads to one side, they could kiss just fine. Before long, they even started to like each other. And soon they were all living happily enough, and realized that there had never been anything wrong with their noses in the first place. But the chief of the island had to return to the wisest of all men, and get him to persuade the magician who lived by the burning lake to change his nose back to its proper size again, before he dared go home to his own people.
Why birds sing in the morning. A long, long time ago, before you and I were ever thought of, and before there was any distinction between day and night, the King and Queen of Light had a baby daughter. She was the most beautiful of all creatures. When she first opened her eyes, they were so bright, they filled the world with light. Everywhere she went, creatures were glad to see her. Plants grew at her touch, and animals would come out of their holes just to sit and watch her go by. In a cave not far away there lived the Witch of the Dark. She too had an only child, a son. He was a sickly boy. He was always pale, and sometimes he grew very thin and had to be nursed back to strength. One day, however, the old Witch of the Dark brought her son to court and proposed a marriage between him and the princess. When the King of Light refused, the old witch flew into a rage, and that very night she and her son broke into the king's palace and stole the beautiful princess. They took her and locked her up in a dark cave on the other side of the mountains, and there she stayed for a long time. She cried and cried, but it was no good. The witch would not let the princess out until she agreed to marry her son. Meanwhile, the animals went to the king and said, "Where is your daughter? When she is away from us, all the world is dark. The plants do not grow, and many of us have nothing to eat." The King of Light told the animals what had happened, and all the animals all agreed they would help him look for his daughter. So the lions and tigers went into the jungle and searched there. The rabbits and the moles looked under the earth, and the fish and the turtles searched the seas, but none of them could find any trace of her. Meanwhile, the birds were looking up in the air and treetops, and the eagle flew off into the mountains. It flew up until it was flying over their very summits. Still it flew on, over the other side and down into a region where it had never been before. At length, the eagle grew tired and was forced to rest among some rocks. He hadn't been there long, however, before he heard a beautiful voice singing a sad song. Immediately, he recognized it was the princess, and he called out to her. But the eagle only had a raucous screech for a voice, and the princess thought it was the old witch returning, so she stopped her singing and would not make another sound. The eagle sat there wondering what to do, when all at once he saw a black speck in the sky. It was the witch's son coming to visit the princess on his mother's broomstick. The eagle hid and watched as the witch's son rolled aside the great stone at the entrance of the cave. Immediately, a great brightness flooded out from the cave as the beautiful princess came out and filled everywhere with light. But she had tears in her eyes, and a rainbow shone all around her. "Ah!" cried the witch's son, "I'm tired of waiting." And he took hold of the beautiful girl and threw her on the ground, whereupon the eagle swooped down on them, snapping his beak fiercely at the witch's son, and lifted the princess up onto his back. The witch's son grabbed his mother's broomstick and started hitting out at the eagle. By accident, however, he struck the princess a blow on the side of her head, so hard that the broomstick broke in two. But the princess held tight to the eagle, and they soared up into the sky. The eagle carried the princess back across the mountains, and wherever they flew, they lit up the world that had been lying dark for so long. And the witch's son got on the broomstick and followed after them, but because the broomstick was broken, he could never quite catch up with them. At length, however, the eagle had to rest again. He let the princess down off his back and told her to hide, promising to wake her up as soon as the witch's son had gone past. So the princess hid in a cave, and the world went dark once more while the witch's pale sun flew past in the sky. When he had gone, the eagle tried to wake the princess up, but the blow from the broomstick had made her a bit deaf, and even the eagle with his raucous voice could not wake her. So the eagle asked some sparrows to help him, and they all made as much noise as they could, but still the princess did not wake up. Eventually, the eagle went round all the birds in the neighbourhood and got them all to make as much noise as possible. Finally, the princess awoke and came out of the cave, lighting the world as she did so. "Quick," said the eagle, "get on my back. We must be off before the witch's son comes past again on his broomstick." So the princess got on his back again, and away they flew, bringing light to the world wherever they went. And so they continued to this day, for the princess and the eagle were turned into the sun, and still they ride high up in the sky, and the witch's son was turned into the moon. And at the end of every day when the eagle has to rest, the princess hides while the witch's son goes past. And if you look up at the moon, you can still see him with his mother's broken broomstick over his shoulder. The princess is still as beautiful as ever, now she is the sun. But she's also a little deaf, and that is why all the birds sing as hard as they can every morning in order to wake her up.
A Fish of the World. A herring once decided to swim round the world.
"I'm tired of the North Sea," he said. "I want to find out what else there is in the world."
So he swam off south into the deep Atlantic. He swam and he swam, far, far away from the seas he knew, through the warm waters of the equator and down into the South Atlantic. And all the time, he saw many strange and wonderful fish that he'd never seen before. Once he was nearly eaten by a shark. And once he was nearly electrocuted by an electric eel. And once he was nearly stung by a stingray. But he swam on, round the tip of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. And he passed by devilfish and sailfish and sawfish and swordfish and bluefish and blackfish and mudfish and sunfish, and he was amazed by the different shapes and sizes and colours. On he swam into the Java Sea, and he saw fish that leapt out of the water, and fish that lived on the bottom of the sea, and fish that could walk on their fins. And on he swam through the Coral Sea, where the shells of millions and millions of tiny creatures had turned into rock and stood as big as mountains. But still he swam on, into the wide Pacific. He swam over the deepest parts of the ocean, where the water is so deep that it is inky black at the bottom, and the fish carry lanterns on their heads, and some have lights on their tails. And through the Pacific he swam, and then he turned north and headed up to the cold Siberian Sea, where huge white icebergs sailed past him like mighty ships. And still he swam on, and into the frozen Arctic Sea, where the sea is forever covered in ice. And he went on, past Greenland and Iceland, and finally he swam home into his own North Sea. All his friends and relations gathered round and made a great fuss of him. They had a big feast and offered him the very best food they could find. But the herring just yawned and said,
I've swam round the entire world. I have seen everything there is to see, and I have eaten more exotic and wonderful dishes than you could possibly imagine."
And he refused to eat anything. Then his friends and relations begged him to come home and live with them, but he refused.
"I've been everywhere there is, and that old rock is too dull and too small for me."
And he went off and lived on his own. And when the breeding season came, he refused to join in the spawning, saying,
"I've swum round the entire world, and now I know how many fish there are in the world, I can't be interested in herrings any more."
Eventually, one of the eldest of the herrings swam up to him and said, "Listen, if you don't spawn with us, some herrings' eggs will go unfertilised and will not turn into healthy young herring. If you don't live with your family, you'll make them sad. And if you don't eat, you'll die." But the herring said,
"I don't mind. I've been everywhere there is to go. I've seen everything there is to see, and now I know everything there is to know."
The old fish shook his head. "No one has ever seen everything there is to see," he said, "nor known everything there is to know."
"Look,"
said the herring,
"I've swum through the North Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Java Sea, the Coral Sea, the Great Pacific Ocean, the Siberian Sea, and the frozen Arctic. Tell me, what else is there for me to see or know?"
"I don't know," said the old herring, "but there may be something." Well, just then, a fishing boat came by, and all the herrings were caught in a net and taken to market that very day. And a man bought the herring and ate it for his supper. And he never knew it had swam right round the world, and seen everything there was to see, and knew everything there was to know.
The Fly-by-Night. A little girl was lying in bed one night when she heard a tapping on her window. She was rather frightened, but she went to the window and opened it, telling herself that it was probably just the wind. But when she looked out, do you know what she saw? It was a little creature as black as soot with bright yellow eyes, and it was sitting on a cat that appeared to be flying. "Hello," said the creature. "Would you like to come flying?" "Yes, please," said the little girl, and she climbed out of the window onto the cat, and off they flew. "Hang on tight," cried the creature. "Where are we going?" asked the little girl. "I don't know," called the creature. "Who are you?" asked the little girl. "I haven't got a name," said the creature. "I'm just a fly-by-night." And up they went into the air, over the hills and away. The little girl looked around her at the bright moon and the stars that seemed to wink at her and chuckle to themselves. Then she looked down at the black world below her, and she was suddenly frightened again and said, "How will we find our way back?" "Oh, don't worry about that," cried the fly-by-night. "What does it matter?" And he leaned on the cat's whiskers and down they swooped towards the dark earth. "But I must be able to get home," cried the little girl. "My mother and father will wonder where I am." "Oh, poop-de-doo," cried the fly-by-night. And he pulled back on the cat's whiskers, and up they soared, up and up into the stars again. And all the stars were humming in rhythm. "Boodle-dum-dee, boodle-dum-da, isn't it great being a star?" And all the stars had hands, and they started clapping together in unison. Then suddenly the moon opened his mouth and sang in a loud, booming voice, "I'm just the moon, and that's fine by me, as long as I hear that boodle-dum-dee." And the cat opened its mouth wide and sang, "Whee!" And they looped the loop and turned circles to the rhythm of the stars. But the little girl started to cry and said, "Oh, please, I want to go home." "Oh, no, you don't," cried the fly-by-night, and took the cat straight up as fast as they could go, and the stars seemed to flash past them like silver darts. "Please," cried the little girl, "take me back." "Spoil sport," yelled the fly-by-night, and he stopped the cat dead. Then tipped it over, and down they swooped so fast that they left their stomachs behind them at the top, and landed on a silent hill. "Here you are," said the fly-by-night. "This isn't my home," said the little girl, looking around at the dark, lonely countryside. "Oh, it'll be around somewhere, I expect," said the fly-by-night. "But we've come miles and miles from my home," cried the little girl. But it was too late. The fly-by-night had pulled back on the cat's whiskers, and away he soared up into the night sky, and the last the little girl saw of him was a black shape silhouetted against the moon. The little girl shivered and looked around her, wondering if there were any wild animals about. Which way should I go? She wondered. Try the path through the wood, said a stone at her feet. So she set off along the path that led through the dark wood. As soon as she got amongst the trees, the leaves blotted out the light of the moon, branches clutched at her hair, and roots tried to trip up her feet, and she thought she heard the trees snigger quietly, and they seemed to say to each other, "That'll teach her to go off with the fly-by-night." Suddenly she felt a cold hand gripping her neck, but it was just a cobweb strung with dew. And she heard the spider busy itself with repairs, muttering, "She went off with the fly-by-night. As the little girl peered into the wood, she thought she could see eyes watching her and winking to each other, and little voices you couldn't really hear whispered under the broad leaves, "What a silly girl, to go off with a fly-by-night. She should have known better." Eventually she felt so miserable and so foolish that she just sat down and cried by a still pond. "Now then, what's the matter?" said a kindly voice. The little girl looked up and then all around her, but she couldn't see anyone. "Who's that?" she asked. "Look in the pond," said the voice, and she looked down and saw the reflection of the moon, smiling up at her out of the pond. "Don't take on so," said the moon. "But I've been so silly," said the little girl, "and now I'm quite lost, and I don't know how I'll ever get home." "You'll get home all right," said the moon's reflection. "Hop on the lily pad and follow me." So the little girl stepped cautiously onto a lily pad, and the moon's reflection started to move slowly across the pond, and then down a stream, and the little girl paddled the lily pad after it. Slowly and silently they slipped through the night forest, and then out into the open fields they followed the stream, till they came to a hill she recognized, and suddenly there was her own house. She ran as fast as she could and climbed in through the window of her own room, and snuggled into her own dear bed. And the moon smiled in at her through the window, and she fell asleep thinking how silly she'd been to go off with a fly-by-night. But you know, somewhere, deep down inside her, she half hoped she'd hear another tap on her window one day, and find another fly-by-night offering her a ride on its flying cat. But she never did.
Katie makes sure. There was once a little girl called Katie, who found an old shoe inside a hollow tree. It was a funny little shoe with a pointed toe, and it was no more than an inch long. "I wonder who it can belong to," she thought, and she slipped it into the pocket of her dress and went on her way. She hadn't gone very far before she heard a sound like this. Tippity-tap, tippity-tap, tippity-tap. She looked round a large oak tree and saw a little goblin hopping around on one foot. "Excuse me," she said, "but is this your shoe?" Well, the goblin danced for joy. "At last!" he cried. "Without my shoes I can't go back to Goblin City." So Katie gave the goblin his shoe, and he put it on and danced around the tree singing, "Short or long to Goblin City, the straight way's short but the long way's pretty." Then he stopped, and he said to Katie, "If you come with me to Goblin City, the king of the goblins will give you a reward." "Well, I could come," said Katie, "but how would we get there?" The goblin just hopped up and down on one leg and chanted, "Short or long to Goblin City, the straight way's short, but the long way's pretty." "But how do I know if it's worth going the pretty way? Or if it'll take too long?" asked Katie. The goblin jumped in the air, twirled round 3 times before he landed on one toe, and said, "Short or long to Goblin City, the straight way's short, but the long way's pretty." "How can I be sure it's not better to go the short way?" asked Katie. The goblin jumped in the air, landed on his head, and span round and round like a top, till he disappeared into the ground, and then reappeared just behind Katie and cried, "Short or long to Goblin City, the straight way's short, but the long way's pretty." "How can I be sure I'll like it, whichever way we go?" asked Katie. The goblin did a somersault and landed on one finger. Then he snapped his finger so hard that he rose into the air, up and up, and then came tumbling down and landed in a dandelion puffball and cried, "Goblin cities far and near, if you want to make sure, you'd better stay here." With that, a puff of wind caught the dandelion and scattered it to the four corners of the world, and the goblin was gone too. And poor Katy never went to Goblin City either way.
The Silly King. King Herbert XII had ruled wisely and well for many years. But eventually he grew very old. And although his subjects continued to love him dearly, they all had to admit that as he had grown older, he had started to do very silly things. One day, for example, King Herbert went out of his palace and walked down the street with a dog tied to each leg. Another time, he took off all his clothes and sat in the fountain in the principal square, singing a selection of popular songs and shouting, "Radishes!" at the top of his voice. Nobody, however, liked to mention how silly their king had become. Even when he hung from the spire of the great cathedral, dressed as a parsnip and throwing Turkish dictionaries at the crowd below, no one had the heart to complain. In private, they would shake their heads and say, "Poor old Herbert, whatever will he do next?" But in public, everyone pretended that the king was as grave and as wise as he had always been. Now it so happened that King Herbert had a daughter, whom, in a moment of slightly more silliness than usual, he had named Princess Fishy, although everyone called her Bonito. Rather conveniently, the princess had fallen in love with the son of their incredibly rich and powerful neighbour, King Rupert, and one day it was announced that King Rupert intended to pay a state visit to King Herbert to arrange the marriage. "Oh dear," said the Prime Minister, "whatever shall we do? Last time King Herbert had a visitor, he poured custard over his head and locked himself in the broom cupboard." "If only there was someone who could make him act sensibly," said the Lord Chancellor. "Just while King Rupert's here, at any rate." So they put up a notice offering 1,000 gold pieces to anyone who could help. And from the length and breadth of the land came doctors offering their services, but it was all no use. One eminent doctor had a lotion which he said King Herbert must rub on his head before going to bed, but King Herbert drank it all on the first night and was very ill. So a second eminent doctor produced a powder to cure the illness caused by the first doctor, but King Herbert put a match to it, whereupon it exploded and blew his eyebrows off. So a third doctor produced a cream to replace missing eyebrows, but King Herbert put it on his teeth, and they all turned bright green overnight. Not one of the doctors could make King Herbert less silly, and he just got ill from their lotions and potions and creams and powders. Eventually the day of the state visit arrived, and King Herbert was still swinging from the chandeliers in the throne room and hitting people with a haddock. Everyone was very agitated. The Prime Minister had chewed his nails right down to nothing, and the Lord Chancellor had gnawed through his chain of office, but no one had any idea of what to do. Just then the Princess Fishy stood up and said, "Since no one else can help, let me try." "Don't talk nonsense, Bonito," said the Prime Minister. 50 of the most eminent doctors in the land have failed to cure the king. What could you possibly do?" "I may not be able to cure the king," said the princess, "but if I could show you how to turn an egg into solid gold, then would you do as I said?" And the Lord Chancellor said, "Princess, if you could indeed show us how to turn an egg into solid gold, then we should certainly do as you told us." "For shame," said the princess. "Then you should do as I say now. I can no more turn an egg into solid gold than you can, but even if I could, it wouldn't prove that I could help my father." Well, the Lord Chancellor and the Prime Minister looked at each other, and because they had no ideas themselves, and because they had no other offers of help, they agreed to do what the princess told them. Shortly afterwards, King Rupert arrived. There were fanfares of trumpets, Drums rolled, the people cheered, and they looked for King Rupert's son, but they couldn't see him. King Rupert was dressed in gold and rode a white horse, and on his head he bore the richest crown anyone had ever seen. The Lord Chancellor and the Prime Minister met him at the gates of the town and rode with him down the main street. Suddenly, just as they were about to enter the palace, an old woman rushed out of the crowd and threw herself in front of King Rupert's horse. "Oh, King Rupert!" she cried. "Dreadful news! An army of 50,000 soldiers is marching through your country." King Rupert said, "Surely that cannot be?" But just then a messenger in King Rupert's own livery rode up on a horse and cried, "It's true, your majesty. It's more like 1,000,000 of them. I've never seen so many." King Rupert went deadly pale and fell off his horse in a faint. They carried him into the throne room, where King Herbert was standing on his head, balancing a box of kippers with his feet. Eventually, King Rupert regained consciousness and found his son and the princess looking down at him. "I'm afraid we're homeless now, my dear," said King Rupert to the princess. "An army of 50 million soldiers has overrun our country. Do you think your father will let us stay here to live?" "Of course he will," said the princess. "Only you mustn't mind if he's a bit silly now and again." "Of course not," said King Rupert. "We're all a bit silly now and again." "That's true," said the prince. "For example, the old lady who stopped you outside the palace was none other than the princess here, but you didn't recognize her." "Indeed I did not," said King Rupert. "And the messenger was none other than your own son," said the princess. "And yet you didn't even recognize him." "Indeed I did not," said King Rupert. "Moreover," said the princess, "you didn't even stop to consider how you could defeat that army of 1,000,000 soldiers." "I have no need to consider it," said King Rupert. "How could I possibly deal with an army of such a size?" "Well, for a start you could pour a kettle of boiling water over them," said the princess, "for they're only an army of soldier ants." Whereupon King Rupert laughed out loud at his own silliness, and agreed that the princess should marry the prince without delay. And he didn't even mind when King Herbert poured lemonade down his trousers and put ice cream all over his crown.
The Ship of Bones. In the days when sailing ships crossed the oceans, blown by the winds, there was one ship that all sailors dreaded to see. It was called the Ship of Bones. Its sails were deathly white, and its figurehead was a skull. And all along its length were carved the names of drowned sailors, and they say that the hull was made from their bones. Well, this is the story of the only man who went aboard the Ship of Bones and lived to tell the tale. His name was Stoker, Bill Stoker, and he sailed on the ship Mayfly that left Portsmouth on the 1st of June, 1784. Well, they hadn't been gone more than a week when they were caught in a storm, in a terrible storm. The waves towered up 6 times as high as the mainmast, and the little ship was tossed about the ocean like a bit of cork in the foam. One moment it was rising up the head of a mighty wave, and the next minute it was dashed down into the trough. And the waters blotted out the sun, and it all went still, until another wave crashed down on her bows. Well, the storm raged on for 4 days and 4 nights. And on the 4th night, the sailors had given themselves up as good as dead. And their sails were in shreds, and the rudder was broken, and half the crew were lying sick in their hammocks, or being tossed across the cabin by the force of the sea. And old Bill Stoker was lying in his bunk, thinking this would be his last night on this earth, when he heard a cry from up on deck, and this sailor comes running down to the cabin as white as a sheet. "It's the Ship of Bones," he cries. "We've had it now for sure, mates." Now old Bill Stoker was not one to take things lying down. "I don't believe in no Ship of Bones," he says, and leaps out of his bunk and climbs up on deck. It was a dreadful night. The rain lashed across its face, and the wind was
blowing up the sea like so many mountains. Bill Stoker peers into the storm, and sure enough, across the tops of the raging waters, he can just make out the whitest ship you ever saw. Its sails were almost glowing white in the darkness. "Well," shouts Bill Stoker, "if that's the ship of bones, I'll eat my hat." Well, just then, a mighty wave smashes across the deck, and before he knows what's hit him, Bill Stoker finds himself lifted high up in the air on top of the wave. And he looks down, and there, 100 feet below, is his own ship. And then suddenly he's thrown through the air by the force of the wave, and he lands slap in the middle of another, and he goes right under. Well, just as he's beginning to gasp for breath, he finds himself shooting out and up into the air again on another monstrous wave. And this time, he looks down and just catches sight of the white ship below him. And when he finds himself hurtling downwards again, and then everything goes deathly quiet and still, well, he opens his eyes and looks around, and sure enough, he's lying right there on the deck of the ship of bones. You can see the black night and the storm raging all about, but the ship itself is quite still, scarcely moving, like as if it were becalmed, and there's not a sound. Bill Stoker puts out his hand and feels the deck, and it's smooth like ivory. And even though the rain and the waves are lashing the ship, the deck itself is quite dry. Well, Bill looks around and sees that he's all alone, except for an old sailor who's winding in the anchor. So he gets to his feet and calls out, "Ahoy there!" But the old sailor doesn't turn round. He just keeps on a-winding in that anchor. So Bill Stoker walks across the deck and says, "Ahoy there, matey, what's to do?" And the old sailor turns round. And you know, he hasn't got a face. Leastwise, not what you'd call a face. More of a skull, and his hands are skeleton hands, and his jaws open, and a cracked voice says, "Welcome to the ship of bones, Bill." And he puts out a bony hand to take hold of Bill Stoker. But old Bill Stoker, he backs away. Then he turns on his heels and runs as hard as he can and ducks below decks. But he can hear the skeleton coming after him. So he shuts the hatch and skids down those steps as fast as he can. Inside the ship, there's a curious smell like you get around tombstones. And Bill Stoker grabs the rail as he goes down, and he notices that everything's made out of bones. White and yellow, old and new. But he can still hear the skeleton footsteps coming after him, so he goes right on down into the hold. It's so dark, he can't see for a bit. Then suddenly he hears a shout. "Why, here's Bill Stoker. Hello there, Bill. Welcome to the ship of bones." And Bill's eyes are used to the dark by now, and he can just see some shapes rising up off their beds and coming towards him. Well, he doesn't stop to see who they are. He doubles back on himself and runs back up the steps. And there's the skeleton sailor, standing at the top, grinning down at him. Well, old Bill Stoker wasn't a man to be scared easy, so he runs up the steps, gets out his cutlass, and strikes at the creature. But the skeleton sailor hops out of the way and grabs Bill's shirt as he runs past. But it's an old shirt, and it rips apart before the thing can get its bony fingers over Bill's throat. And in a trice, Bill's up on deck again and sprinting across to the bridge house. And once inside, he locks the door. But he can hear the bony steps coming nearer and nearer. And he sees that horrible, grinning skull's face leering in at the window. Well, Bill wasn't a man to give up, like, so he thinks to himself, they're just a lot of old bones, all of them. They must be scared of something. And then he gets an idea. I know it'll see old bones off, he cries, and he drops down on all fours and starts barking like a dog. Well, the skull's face sort of frowns, and old Bill flings the door open and leaps out, barking like mad. And do you know, that horrible creature just turns and runs. Whereupon old Bill takes his chance and leaps over the side, and immediately he feels the waves picking him up and flinging him across the water again. Well, I don't know what happened next, and I don't think old Bill knew. But he finally found himself back on his own boat, with his shipmates all standing around him and pointing. And Bill looked out into the night, and he saw that ship of bones going off as fast as it could to wherever it came from. Not long after that, the storm died down, and they came out into calmer waters. And old Bill Stoker told his story to his shipmates, and they all listened with bated breath. But you know, not one of them believed it. But that didn't worry old Bill Stoker, and that evening he sat right down and... Can you guess what he did? He ate his hat.
Three Raindrops. A raindrop was falling out of a cloud, and it said to the raindrop next to it, "I am the biggest and best raindrop in the whole sky." "You are indeed a fine raindrop," said the second, "but you're not nearly so beautifully shaped as I am, and in my opinion it's shape that counts, and I am therefore the best raindrop in the whole sky." The first raindrop replied, "Let us settle this matter once and for all." So they asked a third raindrop to decide between them. But the third raindrop said, "What nonsense you're both talking. You may be a big raindrop, and you are certainly well-shaped, but as everybody knows, it's purity that really counts, and I am purer than either of you. I am therefore the best raindrop in the whole sky." Well, before either of the other raindrops could reply, they all three hit the ground and became part of a very muddy puddle.
Brave Molly. A little girl was once caught in a thunderstorm. The day grew dark and the wind started to blow, and suddenly a fork of lightning streaked across the sky and a great clap of thunder rolled all round her. Oh, poor Molly trembled with fright, and she wished she were back home with her mother. Then it started to rain. Such a cloudburst it was. The heavens just opened up, and down came the rain in great big drops the size of your fist. In the distance, Molly could see a little hut, so she ran up to it, and finding the door open, she slipped into the gloomy inside. No sooner had she shut the door than a deep growling voice said, "Arr, who are you?" Molly looked around her, but the inside of the hut was quite dark, and she couldn't see anyone. Please, my name's Molly," she said. "Who are you?" "Arr, I'm a terrible monster, that's who," said the voice. Just then a bolt of lightning lit up the inside of the hut for a fraction of a second, and in that moment Molly saw a huge black shape crouching against the far end of the hut. "Oh!" she cried. "What's the matter?" growled the terrible monster. "Frightened, are you?" "Indeed I am," said Molly. "You're as black as coal, as big as a house, and covered in hair." "And I've got a terrible roar," said the monster. "Arr!" Poor Molly fell over backwards in her fright, and the thunder crashed over their heads, and another flash of lightning lit up the monster, and Molly could see that he had great black claws and glowing eyes and huge yellow teeth. "Pretty frightening," bellowed the monster. "Oh, yes," cried Molly. "And I'm as strong as 200 oxen," he cried. And as the lightning flashed, Molly saw the monster rear up on his legs and throw the roof of the hut high into the air. "Oh, please don't," cried Molly, as the rain started to pour down on her and the thunder crashed. "And I eat little girls for my supper," roared the monster, and he bent down and put one glowing eye right up against poor Molly and said, "How about that?" Well, Molly thought to herself, it's no use being frightened. If he's going to eat me, he's going to eat me. So she picked up her satchel and hit that monster right on the nose. And do you know what happened? Well, the monster didn't pick her up in his huge claws, and he didn't gobble her up with his great yellow teeth. Do you know what he did? First he turned green, then he turned black, and then he turned bright pink, and a bunch of flowers grew out of the top of his head. "Why, you're not a frightening monster at all," cried Molly. "Aren't I?" said the monster. "No," said Molly. And a beautiful ribbon tied in a bow suddenly appeared right round the monster's middle. And Molly took hold of the ribbon and pulled it, and the monster opened up, and inside was a little rabbit who looked very frightened and said, "Oh, please, don't put me in a pie." And brave Molly said, "I won't put you in a pie this time. But don't go around trying to frighten little children in future." "No, I promise," said the rabbit, and scuttled off out of the hut. And just then the sky cleared and the sun came out, and brave Molly set off home again, and she didn't meet another monster all the rest of the way.
The Corn Dolly. A farmer was cutting his corn when he thought he could hear someone crying far away. Well, he kept on cutting the corn, and the crying got louder and louder until he had only one more shock of corn to cut, and it seemed as if the crying was coming right from it. So he peered into the last bit of corn, and sure enough, there was a little creature made of cornstalks, sitting sobbing its heart out. "What's the matter with you?" asked the farmer. The little creature looked up and said, "You don't care," and went on crying. The farmer was a kindly man, so he said, "Tell me what your trouble is, and perhaps there's something I can do." "You farmers don't care what happens to us corn dollies," said the creature. Now the farmer had never seen a corn dolly before, so he said, "What makes you think that?" The corn dolly looked up and said, "We live in the standing corn. We keep it safe and do no harm to anyone. And yet every year you farmers come with your sharp scythes, cut down the corn, and leave us poor corn dollies homeless." The farmer replied, "We have to cut the corn to make the flour, to make the bread we eat. And even if we didn't cut it, the corn would wither away in the autumn, and you corn dollies would still be homeless." But the corn dolly burst into tears again and said, "Just because we're small and made of straw, you think you can treat us anyhow, and leave us with nowhere to live in the cold winter." The farmer said, "I'll find somewhere for you to live." And he picked up the corn dolly and took it to the barn and said, "Look, you can live here and be snug and warm all through the winter." But the corn dolly said, "You live in a fine house made of stone. Just because us corn dollies are small and made of straw, you don't think we are good enough to live in a proper house." The farmer said, "Not at all." And he picked up the corn dolly and carried it into his house and sat it on the windowsill in the kitchen. "There," he said, "you can live there." But the corn dolly scowled and said, Just because we are small and made of straw, you think we're not good enough to sit with you and your wife." The farmer said, "Not at all." And he picked up the Corn Dolly and carried it to the fireside, and pulled up a chair and sat the Corn Dolly down between himself and his wife. But still the Corn Dolly was not happy. "What's the matter now?" asked the farmer. "Just because we're small and made of straw," said the Corn Dolly. "You sat me on a hard chair, while you and your wife sit in soft chairs." "Not at all," said the farmer. And he gave the Corn Dolly a soft chair. But still the Corn Dolly was not happy. "Is there still something the matter?" asked the farmer. "Yes," said the Corn Dolly. "Just because I'm small and made of straw, you've sat me over here, while you and your wife sit next to the fire and keep nice and warm." The farmer said, "Not at all. You can sit wherever you like." And he picked the Corn Dolly up and put it next to the fire. And just then a spark flew out of the fire and landed on the Corn Dolly. And because it was only made of straw, it burst into flames, and because it was only very small, it was all gone before the farmer or his wife could do anything to save it.
The Butterfly Who Sang. A butterfly was once sitting on a leaf looking extremely sad. "What's wrong?" asked a friendly frog. "Oh," said the butterfly, "nobody really appreciates me." And she parted her beautiful red and blue wings and shut them again. "What do you mean?" asked the frog. "I've seen you flying about and thought to myself, that is one hell of a beautiful butterfly. All my friends think you look great too. You're a real stunner." "Oh, that," replied the butterfly, and she opened her wings again. "Who cares about looks? It's my singing that nobody appreciates." "I've never heard your singing, but if it's anywhere near as good as your looks, you've got it made," said the frog. "That's the trouble," replied the butterfly. "People say they can't hear my singing. I suppose it's so refined and so high that their ears aren't sensitive enough to pick it up." "But I'll bet it's great all the same," said the frog. "It is," said the butterfly. "Would you like me to sing for you?" "Well, I don't suppose my ears are sensitive enough to pick it up, but I'll give it a try," said the frog. So the butterfly spread her wings and opened her mouth. The frog gazed in wonder at the butterfly's beautiful wings, for he'd never been so close to them before. The butterfly sang on, and still the frog gazed at her wings, absolutely captivated, even though he could hear nothing whatsoever of her singing. Eventually, however, the butterfly stopped and closed up her wings. "Beautiful," said the frog, thinking about the wings. "Thank you," said the butterfly, thrilled that at last she had found an appreciative listener. After that, the frog came every day to listen to the butterfly singing. All the time he was really feasting his eyes on her beautiful wings. And every day the butterfly tried harder and harder to impress the frog with her singing, even though he could not hear a single note of it. But one day a moth, who was jealous of all the attention the butterfly was getting, took the butterfly on one side and said, "Butterfly, your singing is quite superb." "Thank you," said the butterfly. "With just a little more practice," said the cunning moth, "you could be as famous a singer as the nightingale." "Do you think so?" asked the butterfly, flattered beyond words. "I certainly do," replied the moth. "Indeed, perhaps you already do sing better than the nightingale. Only it's difficult to concentrate on your music because your gaudy wings are so distracting." "Is that right?" said the butterfly. "I'm afraid so," said the moth. "You notice the nightingale is wise and wears only dull brown feathers so as not to distract from her singing." "You're right," cried the butterfly. "I was a fool not to have realized that before." and straight away she found some earth and rubbed it into her wings until they were all grey and half the colours had rubbed off. The next day, the frog arrived for the concert as usual. But when the butterfly opened her wings, he cried out, "Wow, butterfly! What have you done to your beautiful wings?" And the butterfly explained what she had done. "I think you will find," she said, "that now you will be able to concentrate more on my music." Well, the poor frog tried, but it was no good, for of course he couldn't hear anything at all. So he soon became bored and hopped off into the pond. And after that, the butterfly never could find anyone to listen to her singing.
The Beast with 1,000 Teeth. A long time ago, in a land far away, the most terrible beast that ever lived roamed the countryside. It had 4 eyes, 6 legs, and 1,000 teeth. In the morning it would gobble up men as they went to work in the fields. In the afternoon it would break into lonely farms and eat up mothers and children as they sat down to lunch, and at night it would stalk the streets of the towns, looking for its supper. In the biggest of all the towns, there lived a pastry cook and his wife, and they had a small son whose name was Sam. One morning, as Sam was helping his father to make pastries, he heard that the mayor had offered a reward of 10 bags of gold to anyone who would rid the city of the beast. "Ooh," said Sam, "wouldn't I just like to win those 10 bags of gold?" "Nonsense," said his father. "Put those pastries in the oven." That afternoon, they heard that the king himself had offered a reward of 100 bags of gold to anyone who could rid the kingdom of the beast. "Oh, wouldn't I just like to win those 100 bags of gold," said Sam. "You're too small," said his father. "Now run along and take those cakes to the palace before it gets dark." So Sam set off for the palace with a tray of cakes balanced on his head. But he was so busy thinking about the 100 bags of gold that he lost his way, and soon it began to grow dark. "Oh dear," said Sam. "The beast will be coming soon to look for his supper. I'd better hurry home." So he turned and started to hurry home as fast as he could. But he was utterly and completely lost, and he didn't know which way to turn. Soon it grew very dark. The streets were deserted, and everyone was safe inside and had bolted and barred their doors for fear of the beast. Poor Sam ran up this street and down the next, but he couldn't find the way home. Then, suddenly, in the distance, he heard a sound like thunder, and he knew that the beast with 1,000 teeth was approaching the city. Sam ran up to the nearest house and started to bang on the door. "Let me in," he cried. "I'm out in the streets, and the beast is approaching the city. Listen." And he could hear the sound of the beast getting nearer and nearer. The ground shook, and the windows rattled in their frames. But the people inside said no. If they opened the door, the beast might get in and eat them too. So poor Sam ran up to the next house and banged as hard as he could on their door, but the people told him to go away. And then he heard a roar. He heard the beast coming down the street, and he ran as hard as he could, but no matter how hard he ran, he could hear the beast getting nearer and nearer, and he glanced over his shoulder, and there it was at the end of the street. Poor Sam in his fright dropped his tray and hid under some steps, and the beast got nearer and nearer until it was right on top of him, and it bent down, and its terrible jaws went snack, and it gobbled up the tray of cakes. And then it turned on Sam. Sam plucked up all his courage and shouted as loud as he could, "Don't eat me, beast! Wouldn't you rather have some more cakes?" The beast stopped and looked at Sam And then it looked back at the empty tray, and it said, "Well, they were very nice cakes. I like the pink ones particularly. But there are no more left, so I'll just have to eat you." And it reached under the steps where poor Sam was hiding and pulled him out in its great horny claws. "Oh, please," cried Sam. If you don't eat me, I'll make you some more. I'll make you lots of good things, for I'm the son of the best pastry cook in the land." "Will you make some more of those pink ones?" asked the beast. "Oh, yes, I'll make you as many pink ones as you can eat," cried Sam. "Very well," said the beast, and put poor Sam in his pocket and carried him home to his lair. The beast lived in a dark and dismal cave. The floor was littered with the bones of the people it had eaten, and the stone walls were marked with lines where the beast used to sharpen its teeth. But Sam got to work right away and started to bake as many cakes as he could for the beast. And when he ran out of flour or eggs or anything else, the beast would run back into the town to get them, although it never paid for anything. Sam cooked and baked, and he made scones and eclairs and meringues and sponge cakes and shortbread and doughnuts. But the beast looked at them and said, "You haven't made any pink ones." "Just a minute," said Sam, and he took all the cakes and he covered every one of them in pink icing. "There you are," said Sam. "They're all pink ones." "Great," said the beast, and ate the lot. Well, the beast grew so fond of Sam's cakes that it shortly gave up eating people altogether, and it stayed at home in its cave, eating and growing fatter and fatter. This went on for a whole year, until one morning Sam woke up to find the beast rolling around, groaning and beating the floor of the cave. Of course, you can guess what was the matter with it. "Oh dear," said Sam. "I'm afraid it's all that pink icing that's given you the toothache." Well, the toothache got worse and worse, and because the beast had 1,000 teeth, it was soon suffering from the worst toothache that anyone in the whole history of the world has ever suffered from. It lay on its side and held its head and roared in agony, until Sam began to feel quite sorry for it. The beast howled and howled with pain until it could stand it no longer. "Please, Sam, help me," it cried. "Very well," said Sam. "Sit still and open your mouth." So the beast sat very still and opened its mouth, while Sam got a pair of pliers and took out every single tooth in that beast's head. Well, when the beast had lost all its 1,000 teeth, it couldn't eat people any more. So Sam took it home and went to the mayor and claimed 10 bags of gold as his reward. Then he went to the king and claimed the 100 bags of gold as his reward. Then he went back and lived with his father and mother once more. And the beast helped in the pastry shop and took cakes to the palace every day. And everyone forgot that they'd ever been afraid of the beast with 1,000 teeth.
The Wonderful Cake Horse. A man once made a cake shaped like a horse. That night a shooting star flew over the house and a spark happened to fall on the cake horse. Well, the cake horse lay there for a few moments. Then it gave a snort. Then it whinnied, scrambled to its legs, and shook its mane of white icing and stood there in the moonlight, gazing round at the world. The man, who was asleep in bed, heard the noise and looked out of the window, and saw his cake horse running around in the garden, bucking and snorting, just as if it had been a real wild horse. "Hey, cake horse!" cried the man. "What are you doing?" "Aren't I a fine horse?" cried the cake horse. "You can ride me if you like." But the man said, "You've got no horseshoes and you've got no saddle, and you only made a cake." The cake horse snorted and bucked and kicked the air and galloped across the garden and leapt clean over the gate and disappeared into the night. The next morning the cake horse arrived in the nearby town and went to the blacksmith and said, "Blacksmith, make me some good horseshoes, for my feet are only made of cake." But the blacksmith said, "How will you pay me?" And the cake horse answered, "Well, if you make me some horseshoes, I'll be your friend." But the blacksmith shook his head. "I don't need friends like that," he said. So the cake horse galloped to the saddler and said, "Saddler, make me a saddle of the best leather, one that will go with my icing sugar mane." But the saddler said, "If I make you a saddle, how will you pay me?" "I'll be your friend," said the cake horse. "I don't need friends like that," said the saddler and shook his head. The cake horse snorted and bucked and kicked its legs in the air and said, "Why doesn't anyone want to be my friend? I'll go and join the wild horses." And he galloped out of the town and off to the moors where the wild horses roamed. But when he saw the other wild horses, they were all so big and wild that he was afraid they would trample him to crumbs without even noticing he was there. Just then he came upon a mouse who was groaning to himself under a stone. "What's the matter with you?" asked the cake horse. "Oh," said the mouse, "I ran away from my home in the town and came up here where there is nothing to eat. Now I'm dying of hunger and too weak to get back." The cake horse felt very sorry for the mouse, so it said, "Here you are. You can nibble a bit of me if you like, for I'm made of cake." "That's most kind of you," said the mouse, and he ate a little of the cake horse's tail and a little of his icing sugar mane. "Now I feel much better." Then the cake horse said, "If only I had a saddle and some horseshoes, I could carry you back to the town." "I'll make you them," said the mouse, and he made 4 little horseshoes out of acorn cups and a saddle out of beetle shells. And he got up on the cake horse's back and rode him back to town. And there they remained the best of friends for the rest of their lives.
The Glass Cupboard. There was once a cupboard that was made entirely of glass, so you could see right into it and right through it. Now, although this cupboard always appeared to be empty, you could always take out whatever you wanted. If you wanted a cool drink, for example, you just opened the cupboard and took one out. If you wanted a new pair of shoes, you could always take a pair out of the glass cupboard. Even if you wanted a bag of gold, you just opened up the glass cupboard and took out a bag of gold. The only thing you had to remember was that whenever you took something out of the glass cupboard, you had to put something else back in, although nobody knew quite why. Naturally, such a valuable thing as the glass cupboard belonged to a rich and powerful king. One day, the king had to go on a long journey, and while he was gone, some thieves broke into the palace and stole the glass cupboard. "Now we can have anything we want," they said. One of the robbers said, "I want a large bag of gold." And he opened the glass cupboard and took out a large bag of gold. Then the second robber said, "I want 2 large bags of gold." And he opened the glass cupboard and took out 2 large bags of gold. Then the chief of the robbers said, "I want 3 of the biggest bags of gold you've ever seen." And he opened the glass cupboard and took out 3 of the biggest bags of gold you've ever seen. "Hooray," they said. "Now we can take out as much gold as we like." Well, those 3 robbers stayed up the whole night, taking bag after bag of gold out of the glass cupboard. But not one of them put anything back in. In the morning, the chief of the robbers said, "Soon we shall be the richest 3 men in the world. But let's go to sleep now, and we can take out more gold tonight." So they lay down to sleep. But the first robber couldn't sleep. He kept thinking, "If I went to the glass cupboard just once more, I'd be even richer than I am now." So he got up and went to the cupboard and took out yet another bag of gold, and then went back to bed. And the second robber couldn't sleep either. He kept thinking, "If I went to the glass cupboard and took out 2 more bags of gold, I'd be even richer than the others." So he got up and went to the cupboard and took out 2 more bags of gold, and then went back to bed. Meanwhile, the chief of the robbers couldn't sleep either. He kept thinking, "If I went to the glass cupboard and took out 3 more bags of gold, I'd be the richest of all. So he got up and went to the cupboard and took out 3 more bags of gold, and then went back to bed. And then the first robber said to himself, "What am I doing, lying here sleeping, when I could be getting richer?" So he got up and started taking more and more bags of gold out of the cupboard. The second robber heard him and thought, "What am I doing, lying here sleeping, when he's getting richer than me?" So he got up and joined his companion. And then the chief of the robbers got up too. "I can't lie here sleeping," he said, "while the other 2 are both getting richer than me." So he got up, and soon all 3 were hard at it, taking more and more bags of gold out of the cupboard. And all that day and all that night, not one of them dared to stop for fear that one of his companions would get richer than him. And they carried on all the next day and all the next night. They didn't stop to rest, and they didn't stop to eat, and they didn't even stop to drink. They kept taking out those bags of gold faster and faster, and more, until at length they grew faint with lack of sleep and food and drink, but still they didn't dare to stop. All that week, and all the next week, and all that month, and all that winter they kept at it, until the chief of the robbers could bear it no longer, and he picked up a hammer and smashed the glass cupboard into 1,000,000 pieces. And they all 3 gave a great cry and fell down dead on top of the huge mountain of gold they'd taken out of the glass cupboard. Some time later the king returned home, and his servants threw themselves on their knees before him and said, "Forgive us, your majesty, but 3 wicked robbers have stolen the glass cupboard." King ordered his servants to search the length and breadth of the land. When they found what was left of the glass cupboard, and the 3 robbers lying dead, they filled 60 great carts with all the gold, and took it back to the king. And when the king heard that the glass cupboard was smashed into 1,000,000 pieces, and that the 3 thieves were dead, he shook his head and said, "If those thieves had always put something back into the cupboard for every bag of gold they had taken out, they'd be alive to this day." And he ordered his servants to collect all the pieces of the glass cupboard, and to melt them down and make them into a globe with all the countries of the world upon it, to remind himself and others that the earth is as fragile as that glass cupboard.
Dr. Binoculus's Devil. Dr. Binoculus was a very clever man. He lived a long time ago in a distant land. He was very proud of his learning, and he enjoyed performing in public debates where he could show how much cleverer he was than anyone else. One day, however, Dr. Binoculus decided to sell his soul to the devil. He read in a big book a certain number of magic spells, and late that night, he lit a candle in his study, drew some lines on the floor, and summoned the devil to appear before him. There was a flash, and a puff of smoke, and the smell of brimstone, and, just for a moment, he thought he could hear the roaring of hellfire. But before he could change his mind, there in front of him stood a short gentleman in grey, with a pen tucked behind his ear. "You're not the devil?" cried Dr. Binoculus. No," replied the figure in grey. "The devil is extremely busy at this moment in time. I'm his official representative. Now, if you'd just like to give me your details, we can get on with the sale." And he opened a large leather book that he was carrying. "Wait a moment," said Dr. Binoculus. "I wanted to see the devil himself. I don't want to sell my soul to some half-witted underling." "The devil does apologise most sincerely," said the gentleman in grey. "But it's just a question of feasibility. If you don't want to do a deal with me, that's quite understandable. But we'll just have to let the sale go. We have more than enough to choose from as it is. It's a buyer's market at the moment, you know." In the end, Dr. Binoculus agreed to sell his soul to the devil's representative on what seemed very favourable terms. For 30 years, the devil would give Dr. Binoculus unlimited wealth, fame, and magical powers. And at the end of 30 years, Dr. Binoculus would have to sit and play backgammon with the devil forever. Dr. Binoculus made a cut on his arm and was just about to sign in his own blood when the devil's representative stopped him. He looked around rather furtively and lowered his voice and said, "Look, officially I shouldn't be telling you this, but, well, are you quite sure you know what you're doing?" "Of course I do," said Dr. Binoculus. "You forget. I'm the cleverest man in the world. I've thought out exactly what I will do with my 30 years, and after that the devil can torture me as much as he likes. I've worked it out as a mathematical equation, and the worst pain he could inflict on me will not outweigh the amount of pleasure I will cram into 30 years. "He may not torture you," said the devil's representative. "Then so much the better," said Dr. Binoculus. "It may be worse than torture." "Impossible," cried Dr. Binoculus. "I've thought about every conceivable thing he could do to me, and I'm prepared for anything." The devil's representative glanced over his shoulder and lowered his voice even more. "Look," he said, "I know you're the cleverest man in the world right now, but no matter what you've imagined, I can tell you it will be worse." "I can't believe it," said Dr. Binoculus, and he dipped his pen into the blood from his arm and signed his name in the big book and on 2 contracts. Then the devil's representative went away, and for 30 years Dr. Binoculus became not only the cleverest man in the world, but also the richest and the most respected and the most admired. Naturally, he told no one about his deal with the devil, and everywhere he was revealed for the brilliance of his mind, the sharpness of his wit, and the depth of his understanding. He learnt every language in the world, and there was no branch of science or art which he did not become a master. Finally, though, his 30 years were up, and he had to go down to hell to face the devil, who was now his master. He had prepared himself well for his ordeal, however. He had studied every existing portrait of the devil, and steeped himself in every picture of evil, ugliness, and horror, in order that he would not be aghast at the devil's appearance. As he was taken down into hell by numerous nasty little creatures who pulled at his hair and tugged his clothes, he felt quite cheerful and confident that he could cope with the worst the devil could do. To tell the truth, he felt quite proud of himself, for he had been master of the world when he lived, and now he was prepared to submit to one greater than himself. Indeed, he flattered himself that the devil might well appreciate his fine wit and intelligence, and even find some use for his talents. At length, Dr. Binoculus was brought to the devil's audience chamber. The devil's throne was standing there empty, surrounded by a host of ugly creatures, so evil in their appearance that Dr. Binoculus began to feel uneasy. Then, a scaly monster, whose smell was so loathsome that it made the doctor feel sick, slouched towards the throne and put out a grasping hand towards the doctor, so that he suddenly trembled and gripped by fear of something unimaginable, and an unearthly voice croaked, "Dr. Binoculus, prepare to meet the devil himself." Even Dr. Binoculus felt a little weak at the knees and a little apprehensive, remembering what the devil's representative had said to him all those years ago. "No matter what you've imagined, it will be worse." Suddenly there was a flash, and the throne was engulfed in smoke. Dr. Binoculus braced himself, and then there he was, face to face with the devil, his new master. Dr. Binoculus's jaw dropped, and he went cold with horror. The devil's representative had been right, of course. But it wasn't the hideousness of the devil's features, nor even the cold brutality of that face that was worse than any torture to Dr. Binoculus. It was the appalling realization as he gazed into the devil's eyes, that the devil was clearly stupid.
Of course,
cried Dr. Binoculars.
it's so obvious.
But it was too late. The cleverest man in the world had sold his soul to a fool.
The Sea Tiger. There was once a tiger who told the most enormous lies. No matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't tell the truth. Once the monkey asked the tiger where he was going. The tiger replied he was on his way to the moon, which made his eyes brighter than the sun so that he could see in the dark. But in fact he was going behind a bush for a snooze. Another time, the snake asked the tiger round for lunch, but the tiger said that he couldn't come because a man had heard him singing in the jungle and had asked him to go to the big city that very afternoon to sing in the opera. "Oh," said the snake, "before you go, won't you sing something for me?" "Oh, no," said the tiger. "If I sing before I've had my breakfast, my tail swells up and turns into a sausage, and I get followed around by sausage flies all day." One day, all the animals in the jungle held a meeting and decided they'd cure the tiger of telling such enormous lies. So they sent the monkey off to find the wizard, who lived in the snow-capped mountains. The monkey climbed for 7 days and 7 nights, and he got higher and higher, until at last he reached the cave in the snow where the wizard lived. At the entrance to the cave he called out, "Old wizard, are you there?" And a voice called out, "Come in, monkey, I've been expecting you." So the monkey went into the cave. He found the wizard busy preparing spells, and he told him that the animals of the jungle wanted to cure the tiger of telling such enormous lies. "Very well," said the wizard. "Take this potion and pour it into the tiger's ears when he is asleep." "But what will it do, wizard?" asked the monkey. The wizard smiled and said, "Rest assured, once you've given him this potion, everything the tiger says will be true, all right." So the monkey took the potion and went back to the jungle where he told the other animals what they had to do. That day, while the tiger was having his usual nap behind the bush, all the other animals gathered round in a circle, and the monkey crept up very cautiously to the tiger and carefully poured a little of the potion into first one of the tiger's ears and then into the other. Then he ran back to the other animals, and they all called out, "Tiger, tiger, wake up, tiger!" After a while, the tiger opened one eye and then the other. He was a bit surprised to find all the other animals of the jungle standing round him in a circle. "Have you been asleep?" asked the lion. "Oh, no," said the tiger. "I was just lying here, planning my next expedition to the bottom of the ocean." When they heard this, all the animals shook their heads and said, "The wizard's potion hasn't worked. Tiger's still telling us whopping lies as ever." But just then, the tiger found himself leaping to his feet and bounding across the jungle. "But it's true!" he cried to his own surprise. "What are you doing, tiger?" they asked. "I'm going to fly there," he called. And sure enough, he spread out his legs and soared up high above the trees and across the top of the jungle. Now, if there's one thing tigers don't like, it's heights. And so the tiger yelled out, "Help! I am flying! Get me down!" But he found himself flying on until the jungle was far behind him, and he flew over the snow-capped mountains where the wizard lived. The wizard looked up at the tiger flying overhead and smiled to himself and said, "Ha ha, old tiger, you'll always tell the truth now, for anything you say will become true, even if it wasn't before." And the tiger flew on, and he got colder and colder. And if there's one thing tigers hate worse than heights, it's being cold. At length, He found himself flying out over the sea, and then suddenly he dropped like a stone until he came down splash in the middle of the ocean. Now, if there's one thing that tigers hate more than heights and cold, it's getting wet. "Ugh," said the tiger, but down and down he sank right to the bottom of the ocean, and all the fish came up to him and stared, so he chased them off with his tail. Then he looked up, and he could see the bottom of the waves high above him, and he swam up, and just as he was running out of breath, he reached the surface. Then he struggled and splashed, and tried to swim for the shore. Just then, a fishing boat came by, and all the fishermen gasped in amazement to see a tiger swimming in the middle of the ocean. Then one of them laughed and pointed at the tiger and said, "Look, a sea tiger!" And they all laughed and pointed at the tiger. And if there's one thing tigers hate worse than heights and cold and getting wet, it's being laughed at. The poor tiger paddled away as fast as he could, but it was a long way to the shore, and eventually the fishermen threw one of their nets over him and hauled him onto the boat. "Oh," they laughed, "now we can make a fortune by getting this sea tiger to perform tricks in the circus." Now, this made the tiger really angry, because if there's one thing tigers hate more than heights and cold and getting wet and being laughed at, it's performing tricks in the circus. So as soon as they landed, he tore up the net and leapt out of the boat and ran home to the forest as fast as his legs would carry him. And he never told any lies, ever again.